Welcome to the Jewish Drinking Show, the #1 podcast for drinking in Jewish wisdom, history, tradition, and more. Welcome to the 110th episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan, and I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Dr. Jon Seligman. For those less familiar with Dr. Seligman, he is an archaeologist at the Israel Antiquities Authority. Previous positions include Director of the Excavations, Surveys, and Research Department and the Jerusalem Regional Archaeologist. Dr. Seligman studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and University College London, receiving his doctorate, summa-cum-laude, from Haifa University on the subject of the rural hinterland of Jerusalem during the Byzantine period. Dr. Seligman has directed some 30 excavations in Jerusalem, Beit Sha'an, the Carmel Mountains, Yavneh, and the Great Synagogue of Vilna, and has published widely, including 3 books, numerous chapters and articles in refereed books, journals, and other publications. So, Dr. Seligman, welcome.
Thank you, and we're ready.
Yes. Actually, I'm quite curious now because all of those places seem to have been in Israel except for Vilna. So how did Vilna
That's
come
correct. That's my most recent project. I've been working in Vilna now for 5 years.
Oh, really?
Excavating the Great Synagogue.
Oh, wow.
Great Synagogue of the Gaon of Vilna. So that's it's a very, very interesting and important site, especially if one comes from a lit back background like myself. So that's that's the connection to that.
That's very neat. That's very neat. All right. But focusing on your Israel work. So we have you on because of your recent discovery within the last year, right? Or at least it was made public within the last year about the vineyard.
No, actually from last year. From last year.
Yeah, because it came on my radar. There was October articles, I believe, about the Kerem Yavneh, the vineyard at Yavneh.
Yeah, well, we had we've been excavating there for last year and a half. It's a huge site. The publication of it only happened in the summer of last summer. So that's when the actual publication of this extraordinary find was finally made to the press and to the public itself.
That's wonderful. So we know it's a vineyard and we know it's in Yavneh. What time period really does it encompass that at least your findings?
Well, I think we sort of back slightly. I mean, the very famous phrase "Kerem Yavneh," the name of the vineyard in Yavneh, which is connected to the period of the Sanhedrin meetings of the great sages of the Sanhedrin, which is then recounted in the Mishnah, and it's recounted in the Talmud Yerushalmi, where they talk about basic discussions which take place in the vineyard between the sages. And that happened directly after the destruction of the temple, when Yochanan ben Zakkai and Gamliel come to Yavneh, and they basically established modern Judaism. You could place it that way. I mean, that's talking about the whole re-establishment of Judaism as post-temple worship. So it's an important place for talking about Jewish history. Many of the major parts of modern Jewish prayer, etc., are established in Yavneh, and that's where it takes place.
Mm-hmm.
But the finds we've made are...
I was going to quickly say, for those maybe less familiar with the chronology, that we're talking about the last few decades of the first century of the Common Era, basically.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, we're talking... Yeah. I mean, Yochanan ben Zakkai actually comes during the revolt. He comes to Yavneh. He's allowed to come there by Vespasian and to set up the Sanhedrin as a sort of moderate counter to the zealots are doing in Jerusalem, and that's the placing it should be. That's the context it should be given. The finds we have at the moment come from a few centuries later, obviously in the same vineyards, and by this time. We're talking about the Byzantine period. We're talking about the late 4th, 5th, and into the 6th, and even to the 7th centuries. The whole area of the southern coastal plain of Israel becomes a very important of wine growing and of wine of wines which fit into what we would now call a terroir. In other words, a wine area which is connected to specific space, which has a particular taste. And this particular wine, which is known by the name Gaza and Ashkelon wines, I'll tell you why in a moment, becomes exceedingly popular in the whole of the Mediterranean area. The whole of this wine seems to be a white wine, and it seems to be slightly sweet, and it was and great and light. And how do we know that? Because the wine was of such good quality that the historians of the period described it. We have a very important historian called Flavius Coripius, who is the biographer of Emperor Justin II, who says that the wine that came from this area, from the area of Ashkelon and Gaza, was such good quality that it was presented during the coronation of the Emperor Justin II at his table. So they had to say it. His table obviously was in Constantinople, Istanbul today. So the wine had to be brought all the way there, and then it was then served at the table of the coronation. So it was an important and a good quality wine. Why Ashkelon? Today we talk about the Jaffa orange. The Jaffa orange doesn't necessarily in Jaffa, but Jaffa was the port from which Jaffa oranges were exported to Europe right up from the 18th century right up until modern times, and it has the trademark of the port where it was exported from is Jaffa, and that's the reason that it's given the name. For the same reason, the wines that came from the southern coastal plain of Israel during the Byzantine period were exported through the ports of Ashkelon and from Gaza, and that's the reason they received the name of the port from which they were exported.
Despite having been produced inland, but they were just exported from there.
Well, they were exported. The wine growing region was quite a large area that's extended from Yavneh all the way south to Gaza. It's quite a large area, and there are a whole series of sites which are associated with this particular wine industry. And we get an idea that this was a major player, because not only was the wine good quality, it was also produced in huge quantities. We're talking about the period of when Holy Land was an important pilgrimage place. Christians were coming to the Holy Land on pilgrimage to see the holy sites, developed a taste for the local wine, and then took that taste back. And the wine was then packaged in a particular kind of jar, which we call a Gazan jar. The Gazan jar is produced in huge quantities.
But
sorry, you want to ask me?
Yeah, you're already by the 5th, 6th centuries, people were going on pilgrimage to Israel? Christians, I mean?
They were going on pilgrimage already from earlier than that. Yeah, already from the end of the 2nd century, they were already making their way out to see the holy sites.
Oh, wow.
By the time you reach the 4th century, when Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian, it converts to Christianity, that pilgrimage is in huge numbers. So much so that they then repopulate the area of Jerusalem, which by that time had been depopulated because of the destruction of the temple. And the repopulation is from Christian pilgrims who've made Aliyah, you could put it that way, who've come there and they've settled in the area of Jerusalem. And they're coming from all over the Christian world. They're coming from as far away as the British Isles, all the way through into Iraq. They're coming from great distances to settle in the area. And in the reverse, we find the wine jars that come from this area back in those places. So the wine jars that are produced in the area from Yavneh all the way through to Gaza, carrying that particular wine, for those who have not stayed but have gone back to everything, are then carried back with them. And we find those jars in excavations all the way around the Mediterranean, and we found them in Britain. We find them all the way up the rivers, like all the way up the Danuba River, up the Volga River, down through the Rhine. So it gets exported all the way along the waterways, all the way through Europe, in very large quantities.
So I have a few questions. The first of which, how large are these? How much volume do these jars contain that people transported?
The jars, 18 liters. That's the size of the jars. 18 to 20 liters, because they're handmade jars, so they're not all exactly the same size, but general size is about 8 to 20 liters, long sort of torpedo-shaped jars. The quantities, you just an idea, we have huge kilns for making these in Yavneh itself, but also in Ashkelon and other sites around along the coastal plain. We're talking probably up on 100,000 jars of this are made like this every year just in Yavneh. So we're talking a huge amount of wine and a huge amount of vessels.
That's really impressive. And I mean, I get that there's a sense of quality to these, as you were mentioning. I mean, especially for them, they're not light, right? So you have to have the transportation methods to be able to get them these far distances. But what was it? I mean, I guess sort of a broader sense of what was, whether for Britain or throughout Europe or sort of the Levant, but what was the quality of wine elsewhere? Like, was it noticeably that different, or was it just it has its own specific taste to it that was just something you couldn't get elsewhere? Do we know much about wine
we know
production
a
at the
huge
time?
amount about wine. We know a huge amount about wine. Wine's talked about constantly. It's talked about constantly in the Bible. It's talked about constantly in the New Testament. It's talked about constantly by the various writers. They know their wines. They know wines coming from different regions. They know the qualities of wines and the taste of wines coming from various places all around the Mediterranean. The fact that the Mediterranean basin, the fact that they had that Justin II during his coronation had wine from there, but he had other wines as well. So he had wines also from Sarepta and from Byblos, and he had them also from Knidos in the Greek islands. So he had a whole selection of wines, and he knew the difference, right? So these are there was taste for wine. Wine would be, I imagine, slightly different to the taste that we know today. There were various things that made it more difficult. One was it was probably lighter, less alcohol than it was today. One of the big problems when you're producing wine is controlling of temperature during the fermentation process. And today wine is produced in usually in large vats made out of stainless steel that are refrigerated during fermentation. And the reason you do that is to stop the yeast heating up too much, because yeast, as it goes through the chemical process or biological process, actually creates heat. And that heat, when it reaches when you reach about 38 degrees centigrade, the yeast dies. So today you refrigerate it to stop the dying of the yeast. But in times before that, every time you reached that temperature, the yeast would then die off. And of course, that was often before all the sugar had turned to alcohol. And so wines we usually have a lighter and slightly sweeter than we would drink them today.
Oh, interesting.
And of course, when you describe a taste, that's something which is pretty subjective. Describing taste is what I taste is what I taste, and what you taste is what you taste. And carrying that on through history, it's a pretty difficult thing to do. You get an idea of basics, but many things are a matter of personal experience. So what was the quality of that wine? We can only judge on a very on sort of a limited basis of ideas about what that wine tasted like.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode featuring Rabbi Ezra Friedman discussing Shemitah and wine.
If you drink a cup of regular wine, I'm sure it would never happen to any of your listeners, the type of wine you drink. But there's a little bit left on that little cup, a little area where it seeps in on the bottom of the cup there. So on a regular year, you might wash out. On our bathing, you have to add water and drink it. Every single drop is holy. Can't let it fall out.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into next week's episode. Now back into this episode with Dr. Jon Seligman. Do we know anything about the people who were involved in the production of this? Or, I mean, you were saying clearly there was a demand for this and there was a huge output of volume of wine. Do we know, I guess, what are some of the other findings that you've discovered or uncovered in the course of your archaeological exploration there?
Well, first we have the wine presses themselves, and there are 8 wine presses. They're huge. They are absolutely huge. And they're all identical, which would seem to show that we're not talking about within the same sort of urban fabric, the urban framework. They've been built together. They're built as part of one industrial process, which would seem to indicate that they're produced by one landowner, somebody who's got central control over this industry. And is employing a huge amount of people from the surrounding area in his industry. So that seems to be the case, and that is also the case in other wine estates, which are very, very similar, being found in the surrounding area, in Ashkelon, in Gan Yavneh, and in other sites along the coastal plain. So there would be, and the wine presses there are identical design to the ones in Yavneh. So we're talking about an industry which is an area industry, and it seems to have some sort of centralized control, sort of centralized administrative control. Wine is being produced in the States for production. The production we're reaching is we can reach about 1 to about 1.5 million liters annually in just in Yavneh. Just that gives you an idea of the size. That is to industrial scale even today.
Wow.
Now, one of the things we should note is that people are drinking wine at much greater quantities than we would drink today. Often the reason was that there were two main reasons. One, there are lots of calories in wine, and that's a very easy way of getting basic nourishment. So there is that's one aspect, and the other aspect is that the water would kill you. The water was often polluted, especially during the summer months. So by the time you reach the summer months, people would often be with the water. Often would not be the best thing to drink. So people would be drinking. They'd be drinking wine as a healthy drink, something that would keep you alive.
Yeah.
So otherwise you get typhus and cholera from the water source.
Yeah. Why specifically the summer? Why was the summer water worse?
Because in Israel we only have rain up until April. From April till October, there is rain. So your sources are limited to whatever you can get from a well, sometimes from a cistern. And by the time you're reaching in the middle of the summer, some of the sources are not great. And so water was considered something which was, wine was produced. It was something which was considered a safe drink. So it was drunk in larger quantities than we see it today, and similar to sort of quantities that were drunk in 19th and 18th century Italy and Greece. Those are the kind of quantities that are drunk. I don't know if you've ever been in France to one of the wine cooperatives. You go there and they fill your flagon of wine with like a petrol pump. You get a big huge jar and they fill it with table wine from a petrol pump. You get it pumped in great quantities. That's the sort of way we should be looking at it. I mean, the bottles were 18.
Yeah, they're huge.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
We discussed earlier this notion from the first and probably through the second century that rabbis repaired to the Kerem Yavneh, the vineyard at Yavneh. Have you found anything yet from that era going back a few centuries previously? And also, I'm going to throw in another question, which is, I imagine that they knew that this was a vineyard growing area. So presumably this might have been an expansion off of the earlier Kerem Yavneh operation.
We have indication of vineyards in that area going back at least to the 5th century BC. So even prior to that, we have a very large vineyard wine press also from the Persian period, from the 5th century. So this is an area which is an area of wine growing traditionally. It's not something which sort of starts in the Byzantine period where we're excavating, and not in it's something which is a traditional industry of this area. We also know that there is a very large industry of ceramic jar production in the area, which goes all the way back to the Middle Bronze period. So this is an area which we're talking 4,000 years, right? So so this is an area which obviously is a well-known area for wine production going way back in history, way before the period of the Sanhedrin, and this is a traditional industry in this area of the country. By the way, it is no longer a traditional area of wine production.
Yeah,
wine production is not considered very good in this area, and most of the wine production in Israel is conducted in hilly areas, the Judean hills, Galilee, the Golan Heights, and the vineyards that do grow on the coastline are considered of low quality. So it's an interesting sort of twist in fate history, but the major reason would have been transport. In other words, if you want to be exporting large quantities in earlier periods out of the country, sea transport is much easier than land transport. So that's the reason it's been growing in that region.
Wow. So I imagine that, I guess that was when, was there any post your archaeological, the Byzantine findings, was there much grown in that area since then? Obviously, you're saying the contemporary modern Israel, no one's really doing vineyard work there, but
that's correct. Yeah, there are a few, but they're quite limited in that particular area of the country. What happens to the wine industry in the whole of Israel and the Holy Land after the entry of Islam into the country is a very interesting subject, and we haven't yet completely understood the process. But there is a process which leads to the complete disappearance of the wine industry, which is only then reinstituted by Baron Rothschild in the 19th century. So, and by the way, with varieties which are French varieties. So the varieties today which we drink in Israel are Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay, Grenache, Petit Syrah. So which are French varieties, which were introduced originally by the Baron Rothschild. And back then they were using varieties which were different varieties, local varieties. One of the things we're trying to research is what are those varieties. That's something which is an interesting aspect. But let me just get back to what happens in the industry. In the Byzantine, very, very big industry all over the country. With the entry of Islam, which doesn't take place sort of immediately, it takes place as a process over about 100, 150 years. We get a gradual decline in the wine industry until it completely collapses. So this is something we see as a process across the whole country archaeologically, and obviously for obvious reasons. They would use grapes as something which they would eat, but they wouldn't, of course, use it fermented. So there are only two products which they use grapes for during the Islamic period. One is grapes just for eating grapes, and the second one is for something which is grape molasses. Now, what is grape molasses? Until the entry of modern sugar, which happens in the 12th century, the sugar is made by basically taking grape juice and boiling it until it becomes like a black, thick syrup, molasses, which is then used as a sweetener. And you can still buy that sweetener. It's called dibis, or grape honey, which is sold as a sweetener up until the 12th century when the sugar cane then gets introduced. But that doesn't. Up until that time, those are the two products which continue in use, but much less quantities than were during the Byzantine period. So,
when it was a Muslim rule, did they forbid even the Jews from making and consuming alcohol?
No, there is no. The forbidding is a sort of a mitzvah rather than an enforcement. Right? It's not if you could put it into Jewish terms, right? The idea is that somebody who's a Muslim does not drink. We're not talking Saudi Arabia here. We're talking somebody who's a Muslim does not drink. But if you're a Jew or a Christian, you do drink. So there is some limited production of wine that continues, but it's not something which is of great numbers, because the numbers of Jews and Christians after the entry of Islam in the country is greatly reduced, and so we get a much more limited production. And we find various sites where there is some production of wine, but it's much limited than what it was in the earlier periods. One of the interesting aspects is what was the variety of grape used to make wine, because obviously that impacts on the taste of whatever you're producing. Trying to work that out through work with DNA, by taking remains of wine from the jars themselves, analyzing the pits, and various things to analyze biologically and chemically what was that variety. Up until now, that is still an open question. We don't know what varieties really were used for wine during those early periods. But you've been able to get some data from the residue, right? It's just matching it up to the particular varietal is the challenge. That's the huge challenge, because basically a grape is a grape is a grape. So the fact that you find that there is grapes, for example, in a jar, well, that's almost banal. It carried jar. There was wine in them, so there's remains of wine. And identifying the exact type of grape that is done more mostly by the morphology of the pitch and the DNA is much more difficult. So there have been various attempts which have been made in Israel over the last decades to reproduce from local varieties of grapes, which are found residual varieties. But those residual varieties are usually from eating grapes rather than wine grapes, and the wine produced is not of the highest quality. So it's still an open question. The varieties like kabuki and things like that, which are nice deep, but they're not great. Don't produce great wine.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
Well, the winemaking process is something which we can really follow as we look at the production in the wine presses themselves. The wine presses, by following the different stages within the wine presses, we can get an understanding of how wine was produced. One of the major issues was to do it quickly. And that's the reason for the large size of the wine presses themselves. Why did it quickly? Because the time period of harvest means that you have to get the grapes off the vine and in through the process quickly as possible before they start basically to rot. So because once you've removed the grape from the vine itself, fermentation starts immediately. It's not something which is a process which takes time. Within a few hours, you've got fermentation starting to take place. So you've got to get processed quickly. It's got to be, the wine has got to be taken mostly from vines which are local. So we're talking about the whole area. Yavneh, the wine vineyards of Yavneh is where they're coming from the local area. They're being brought to the production facilities. As I said, they are very large wine presses, and that's the reason that you've got large wine presses. That one, you can produce a large amount of, you can process a large amount of grapes simultaneously, and also you can manage simultaneous processes within the wine press itself. But if I've taken wine, I've pressed it, and it's gone to my vat, and then it has to stay in the vat for initial fermentation, which takes about 3 to 4 days. During that period, my vat is my wine press is out of use. It's not it's not useful, because the vat is closed off. You can't press during that period. So what they did is they built multiple vats around the processing system, around the central trading floor. So there would be a possibility of pressing and filling one vat, allowing that vat to then go through initial fermentation, and then simultaneously closing off the pipe and letting the channel of the grape juice go to another vat. And those are huge vats, which then you would take your jars, fill them, and then they would then go for a secondary fermentation, because of the process of a sort of a wavy kind of fermentation. In other words, because of the heat and then the reduction of heat, because of the heating of the yeast, you would get a number of phases of fermentation of the wine itself. Firstly, in the vat, and then in the jars themselves. There are huge storerooms at the site as well, which were used for storing the jars before taking them for export and for local use as well, because obviously they were drunk also locally. So we have the whole thing, the whole process over there available. And also of great importance was that the jars themselves are produced right next to the vats. Sorry, right next to the wine presses. So the jars are produced on site. Everything's produced on site, and that reduces the amount of what we today you would bring your packaging from a factory from China, but that wasn't the possibility at that time. So you would produce the big cost was transport, because we're talking when the roads were pretty bad. At best you had carts, so the transport was the big issue, and so that was producing your containers on site and then transporting them directly to the port. That was of great importance reduce the amount of travel that you had to do with various parts of the process of the winemaking itself.
It's really interesting. I'm also thinking you were talking about the sort of the speed and the timing and the temperature, the weather, because the harvest season is August, September. It's like it's in a warm part of the year, right?
It's
August,
September, October usually.
Yeah, September, October. Yeah,
September, October usually. Yeah,
it is a warm time of year.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So that's one. So process. Having things covered in shade was important, but that's one of the big differences between wines which are northern, for example, in modern Europe, wines that are produced in southern and northern Europe are very different because the amount of the timing of fermentation is different. In Champagne, which is in northern France, temperatures and when they are much lower than they are in things, so fermentation is much slower. These things different from, I don't know, Rioja in Spain, where you've got my hot area. So these are very important aspects which of course change the taste, and that's the reason that wine is such an interesting drink, that it's different from wherever you're taking it from.
And you can have varying levels of sweetness because of the different fermentation and possibilities.
And the land is important. What land you're producing it on, whatever, everything is important in wine, as all the aficionados would tell you. It's all important. You can talk about it endlessly. We had a number of visits from modern winemakers who came in there to see what was going on. They were very interested to see what the process was. And there was big argument about it goes like this, it works like that. That's definitely something which
that's really interesting.
Other thing is another thing that's worth noting is when we talk about ancient winemaking, especially the Mishnah has a huge amount of information about winemaking. Many of the names of various parts of the wine press we still argue about what is the meaning. I mean, we have a gap in in Jewish winemaking of 1,500 years. So from Jewish winemaking in Eretz Israel during the period of the Mishnah up into the 19th century. So what do all the different terms mean? So we have many terms which are in winemaking, showing the sophistication of the process during that time. Because if you've got so many different names of different parts of the wine press itself and of different kinds of wines, there are probably about 40 different kinds of wines which you mentioned just in the Mishnah. So what were the differences in those wines? All ranging all the way from Yain Nesich, from I think all the way through to vinegars. So these things were these were definitely aspects which were of great interest to the editors of the Mishnah, and they knew the process and the different parts of the wine press which we didn't even identify today.
Yeah, it makes me think about in a very different context, but there's a famous article by Professor Chaim Soloveitchik where he's talking about the way that the Tosfos, including Rabbeinu Tam, were trying to figure out these particular parts of the process from the Mishnah and elsewhere, and trying to identify, because some of these things changed, obviously geographically, but chronologically. So,
we have many archaeologists who that's their field of study, is trying to identify from the Mishnah the different things. Obviously, that's done in a more archaeological, historical aspect, and interrelating it into the other sources, because the sources, the people during the time of the Mishnah didn't live in a vacuum. They were influenced by what was going on in their surroundings. So they, for example, there are sources, Strabo and Pliny and Colominos and all different Latin sources. They also talk about the production of wine. They also have terms. Some of those terms interrelate to terms that are written in the Mishnah, which obviously Soloveitchik would relate to, less than the historian does. And and some terms also obviously have Greek origins. So you've got to sort of start you've got to sort of start interrelating from what's going on in other areas of the world where they're also producing wine and also writing about it during the same time period.
Dr. Seligman, thank you so much. This has been really insightful. But before we go, is there anything that you would like to promote?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think as it's my new project, the project in Lithuania, project to the Great Synagogue of Vilna, where we've been excavating, which is probably the most important synagogue and Jewish center of in Vilna itself, center of the Mitnagdim, which was a synagogue built in the 16th century, and that synagogue was then destroyed from the end of the war to the 1950s. We've now been working on it now for a number of years to try and excavate the remains of that synagogue, which has produced extraordinary results, including inscriptions and a yad from the Torah and various other things which we found during excavations. So we very much hope that within the coming years there will be some way to memorialize not only the Great Synagogue of Vilna, but also a very important community, which is the origin of so many communities outside, and the origin of the communities in the United States, Canada, South Africa, Britain, here in Israel as well. So many people came from that community, or Litvaks. So that was a very, very important place, and this was the very epicenter of that particular community. And so that's something we're very much interested in. Anybody who wants to find out information about that could go onto the website for the excavation. So they just need to write down my name, Seligman, Vilna, and they'll find the website immediately, I think.
Great. Wonderful. All right, Dr. Seligman, this has been really fascinating, very insightful. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
All right. And L'chaim. L'chaim.
L'chaim, absolutely. L'chaim.